Hello, I'm Bob Alico, founder, past president of SCAD Research, and I wanted to bring to your attention a great thing that Mayo Clinic had done for us. In the February issue of Mayo Clinic magazine, they featured SCAD Research Inc. They shared the story with all the employees at Mayo Clinic by putting it on every computer screen across the Mayo Clinic organization. Then they brought us a framed reprint of the article, beautifully done. And as I talked to Dr. Hayes, she tells me that by showing up on every monitor one day through the whole Mayo Clinic organization, that people started coming to her and said that they had no idea that she had an organization that she was working with that was helping fund research. An organization that started at the grassroots, just all volunteers, with one determined purpose, was to find out what causes SCAD and how to possibly eliminate it. It increased our visibility within the Mayo Clinic system absolutely incredibly. The title of the article is Benefactor Channels Grief into Action by Supporting SCAD Research. The link is in the description. Share it with anybody and everybody, just to hope that in case somebody either is a SCAD patient or we know still there are going to be future SCAD patients, share the article so that you can get it out to people and people can get it out to other people. That will be the best thing that could happen from this article. So if you would please, share the link, I think it would do us a whole bunch of good. I appreciate all your time and all your effort, especially over these 12 years. We wouldn't have gotten here without all of you. Thank you.
Introducing our new board members. Director Christy Pals. Christy is co-founder and owner of Envision Planning, a fast-growing Colorado-based medical equipment planning company that provides agile project management and procurement services for the United States' leading healthcare systems. Christy lost her mom, Nancy Snow, to SCAD. With over 25 years of industry experience, Christy has grown Envision into an industry standard for equipment, procurement, and transition planning for small to large and multi-phased healthcare projects. Christy proudly supports minority and women-owned business organizations and received awards for her support in hiring active military personnel and veterans. Prior to founding Envision, Christy managed global services for AT&T as a Cisco Certified Network Associate. She enjoys history and antiques, time in the Colorado mountains, and traveling with her family, including her partner, 2 children, and their partners. Director Charlene S. Barnes. A resident of Oceanside, California, Charlene hails from Jamaica but moved to New York with her family. Following her active service in the United States Marine Corps, she made California her home after being stationed there for 3 years as a Marine. Charlene contributes to several charities by running races and fundraising on their behalf. These charities include St. Jude, Make-A-Wish Foundation, and Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. She has been a volunteer with San Diego Volunteer Lawyer Program since 2011, assisting parties unable to afford legal representation. She has also served several terms as the Correspondence Secretary for the Jamaica Awareness Association of California, assisting the underserved in Jamaica and Los Angeles in the areas of education and medical and dental health care. She looks forward to helping to educate the public about SCAD. Director Claude Kinsaku. Claude is Professor Emeritus of Computer Engineering Technology at Oregon Tech in Klamath Falls, Oregon. His engineering and education career spans 34 years, over which he earned several local, state and national awards and recognitions. He served his professional and local communities in many capacities, including as Oregon Tech Faculty Senator for 14 years and as Klamath Falls YMCA Board Member for 9 years. Claude is a SCAD survivor from 2016. Secretary Terry Bell. Terry Bell currently is the Administrative Assistant for the Board Secretary of Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency. Santa Clarita, California has been her home for 34 years, where she has raised her 2 children, and she volunteers for several local nonprofits. She learned about SCAD Research Incorporated when her healthy younger sister Donna had a spontaneous coronary artery dissection in 2015 and then experienced 2 more over the next 7 years. She understands the need for more research as to why SCAD happens and the important work of SCAD Research Incorporated. Terry also owns Solstice Jewelry with her sister. They help to bring awareness of SCAD through one of their collections. Treasurer Nancy E. Hebert. Nancy Hebert retired in 2020 after 25 years at Kaiser Permanente, where she served as both director and manager of finance for the San Diego service area. She coordinated the team responsible for financial analysis, reporting, and budget development. She worked with multidisciplinary teams on major initiatives such as capital projects, including the opening of a new hospital, design input for several financial systems, and analysis and forecasting of medical utilization. Nancy worked at Scripps Health where her positions included financial analyst and project manager. She worked for the New York City Health and Human Services Administration and for the Telecommunications Division of Merrill Lynch. Nancy received her bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, her Master of Urban Planning degree from Princeton University, and her MBA from the New York University Stern School of Business. Vice President Cindy Adams. Since moving to San Diego in 2015, Cindy has been involved in numerous community and civic volunteer endeavors, including over 5 years as a court-appointed special advocate for foster youth. She serves as a volunteer in the emergency department at a large medical center. A participant in the West Coast skedaddles since 2017, Cindy has met many SCAD survivors. The breadth of their experiences has given her a strong understanding of the need for further research to better understand SCAD. Cindy spent over 20 years working in a management capacity at Southern California Edison Company, in the ethics, compliance, and legal departments. Cindy earned a degree in economics from UC Santa Barbara and her MBA degree from California Polytechnic State University in Pomona. President Ellen M. Robin. Ellen is a 13-year SCAD survivor and has coordinated the San Diego skedaddle for the last 7 years. Ellen has held the role of the 5K coordinator for SRI, to help and support the other chairs for the various skedaddles. Ellen became a member of the SRI board in 2022. Her professional career has been in the healthcare industry as a contract administrator for over 30 years. For the last 16 years she has worked at Kaiser Permanente in the role of senior contract manager, where she negotiated contracts for services that are not provided at a Kaiser facility. Prior to joining Kaiser Permanente, Ellen worked at United Healthcare and HealthNet. Her positions there included contract manager and provider relations coordinator. Ellen received her BBA in Healthcare Administration and MBA from National University.
The original board has lasted 12 years. We started about a year ago looking into what the direction SCAD research should go in. We realized the direction we were going was good. We just needed fresh talent to get in there and make it grow further, get it larger. So what we did was we chose a new president, talked for a few months about how to get it done and what to do. And then we had Ellen pick her own board she thought she could work with that would bring SCAD research to where we wanted it to go. And I think the point what I'm really trying to get to tonight is that the original board that did serve you very well for those 12 years, we didn't just decide, well, this is the date we want to step away. We're still here. In fact, they're here tonight. And what we want to do is just like if you've watched the basketball playoffs, you got about 5 starters, and then you probably got about another 8 guys or so sitting on the bench. Well, we have new starters, but we're still on the bench. We're there. We've been working during this whole transition to help with all the work that the treasurer has to do, which is legal and complicated. For the president, we took care of all the legal stuff, the incorporation with the state and everything. We've got a very capable group of people. And I guess the point I'm really trying to get across is it's not ending. It's just taking the second phase to get now even bigger and better. So I hope you give them the cooperation that you've given us all this time. We will be there helping. Jan, my sister-in-law, has been doing the newsletter and a lot of the things with race roster and the 5Ks. So I think there's nothing that's going to change technically. It's just going to be enhanced by having some more people added to the board in a way. So I hope you give them the cooperation you gave us, and I appreciate you giving me, as your original president, all the help that you did, because we have given to Mayo Clinic over $1,300,000 for research. And as we'll hear tonight, there have been results from that research. And I'd like to one more time say thank you very much for the 12 years. Now I'll introduce your new president, Ellen Robbins. Honey, good luck.
Thank you, everybody. I have some big shoes to fill, not to say that I'm not a little nervous, but I'm also very excited. As you saw on the video earlier, the board that we have, we're real excited. We have a great group of people that are willing to volunteer and with their time to help us find answers. We have some great professional people you saw that were on their what they do. We have legal, we have a lawyer, we have a compliance officer, we have a retired financial officer. We have a woman that actually designs cath labs, which most of us survivors have visited. Not that we wanted to, but we've been there. So we're just real excited and looking forward to the next steps for this organization. And as Bob said, nothing's going to change except for the fact that we're looking to grow it even bigger, raise more money, find more answers, and bring awareness. That's one of the things that we want to do. We're looking at working with other organizations. I've been talking to Women Heart, collaborating with other organizations. So there's a lot of really good stuff that's coming up in the next year or two. And so I'm real excited, and I hope that you all are as well. But before we move on to the presentation by the doctors, I just want to give me a second. I got to go get something over there. So I came to this is the 10th annual national, and I came to the very first one in 2012, I believe it was. I was a fairly new survivor myself. I was a year and a half out. I brought my sister because I was scared. I'm sure a lot of you feel that. There's actually survivors in this room that were there. I'm looking at Deb. Deb was there. We called it a SCAD reunion. None of us had ever met. We had met online, but we felt that we had this connection. And the reason why we had this connection is because the organization, SCAD Research, Inc., that was led by Bob, brought us together. Oh, Carrie was there too. Hi, Carrie. And so I want to take this time to thank the board, the past board, for everything that they've done for the last 12 years. We would not be here without them. $1.3 million has been donated to the Mayo Clinic, which is because of what they've done. And so we want to thank them. I'd like to have Jan, you want to come on up here? You guys, Jan runs this organization. She does everything, and she sent me the list of everything she does. I'm like, oh my God. We're not having one person do it. No. It's so, I've worked with you for the many, many years, and I want to thank you for everything that you've done and that you're going to continue the rest of the year. We have a few more skedaddles coming this year, and so there's this, and you get 2 presents.
Oh my goodness!
Just because I know, I want you to open.
Oh, you want me to open?
Yeah.
I don't don't know, what's the polite thing to do, right?
Well, you can read your card later.
Oh, how nice. Thank you.
There's Want me to take this out for you?
Sure.
Jan moved to Colorado. Jan's always cold.
So you bring me long underwear or something?
No, I brought you a
Oh,
blanket.
wonderful.
It says newly great board member is hard to find, difficult to part with, and wait, bring it up. And impossible to forget. Thank you, Jan.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Rick, I don't need you anymore. I've got a nice one.
I don't know how you're going to get that in your suitcase, but that's not my problem. Dave, you want to come on up? Dave has done all of our IT stuff, and so we're very grateful for that, and thank you, and we may be calling you, so thank you very much. Appreciate it. Pete does all of our money. He's the one that sent the $1.3 million to the Mayo Clinic. And Carol, can you come on up here? Don't. So Carol's been very involved with SCAD researching. She's not on the board, but she did this particular event for, 7 years? Something like that. And she does our SCAD store, and we wouldn't be, she does a lot for us, and we really do appreciate it. So this is for you. I want you to. Yeah, don't drop it. It made it here, so I don't want to break it down.
Okay, now you're making me nervous. You're gonna make me cry.
Oh, I've been crying all day.
Come on,
Yeah. It says, SCAD researching, a heartful thank you to Carol. Oh, you're welcome. Okay. All right. And then, Bob, you want to come on up here? So, most of you know Bob's story. And Bob started this nonprofit 12 years ago, not really knowing anything, but he said he was how to run a nonprofit, but he was determined to help find answers for his beloved wife, Judy. And so we're really thankful for everything that you've done. For all of us survivors that are here, we cannot tell you how grateful we are. It has brought us together. We have a great community, and you help keep our community together. And so this is for you. I want you to open it. So it's no. It's not a gold watch, but it's a wooden watch. It's made out of wood. Oh, wait. Here we go. And it has the SCAD Research logo on it.
See it, Nick? Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, thank you. So I think we're running a few minutes. We can have the, that's all I have. But I just, again, want to thank everybody. And we are going to be, one of the things that we're going to be doing on the board is we're going to be having what's called an executive committee, and our board directors are going to be in charge of committees, and then we're going to be meeting volunteers to work on those committees, because we know that Jan did a lot of work, and we really think that we can get a lot more done by having a lot more people helping and having these different committees. And so our board has already met twice. We're going to be meeting next week, and we're going to start creating our executive committees. And so we are looking for volunteers. And so if anybody's interested, please let me know, and greatly appreciate it. Can I bring the doctors up now? Can we do that? Okay. So we're going to now have the Mayo Clinic do the presentation. I'd like to have Dr. Hayes and Dr. Tweet come on up.
So as I wait for Dr. Tweet to come up, I'm honestly not sure how to follow that. Both of us have been there since the beginning of SCAD research at Mayo Clinic, which really was the beginning of SCAD research, honestly. There were other groups who were kind of bubbling up around the same time, 2010, 2011. And some of you have heard this story about Bob calling Mayo Clinic, and it actually went to another colleague who did some genetic work. And that individual who had recently retired said, I don't do that work, but I think Sharonne Hayes might be interested in it. And Bob and I emailed back and forth, and his visceral pain at the loss of his wife was apparent. And I met him for the first time when I went down to Arizona, to Mayo in Arizona. The support of SCAD Research, Inc. and everyone in this year, whether you are a research participant or a donor or just somebody who is passionate about knowing the answers, which we do not have, but we are committed to getting. You are the wind beneath our wings. You are what keeps us going, literally, certainly during the pandemic, when grant funding and other things were non-existent, to help us get to the point, and I'm going to have Dr. Tweet talk about it, where we are able now to compete for external NIH grants, federal money for study of this condition. So we'll talk a little bit, happy to take questions about the process of research. It's sometimes a really slow slog, particularly when you're starting from a dead stop and you're trying to rewrite the history of the knowledge that everyone thought they knew. So thank you to those of you who are board members who are rotating off. You have become friends and supporters. For those of you who've been there since the very first one of these national walks, and I will tell you that when this was being planned, it was going to be a virtual one. Okay? It was going to be a virtual one. That was how it was being advertised. And I said, sure, I'm on hospital service at St. Mary's Hospital. I can get 5K in during rounds. And then I got a call, oh no, there's some volunteers in the Chicago area. They've decided to do a real live one. I said, I'm on call that weekend. I was going to walk around the hospital. You told me it was going to be virtual. But that first year where you're right, it was called a reunion. And I said, reunion from where, right? They've never met each other. And we had folks from Canada and all over the US. And what a special memory and a way to plant the seed for this organization that yes, it raises money for research and wants to find answers, but it has a beating heart of all of the survivors and the SCAD angels who did not survive to make this go forward. So we feel blessed and fortunate to be before you tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've been doing recently. We won't repeat the whole history of SCAD research at Mayo Clinic, but talk about sort of the future and maybe living with SCAD, because one of the things we've heard a lot, and actually we're asked for the Minnesota group is, we get the research and that's important, but what's life after SCAD like? And so we will touch a little bit on some of our clinical practice, because we've now been doing this, seeing patients in our SCAD clinic for over a decade. And I will tell you, we don't always have the answers, but by seeing patients day after day, we hear stories that develop patterns that help us inform research questions and our care. So with that, I will, I also, for those of you who have not met Dr. Tweet, so we started at the beginning. She was already working with me. She was an internal medicine resident. We were working on some other projects. And when this opportunity to study SCAD, I could not think of anybody else that I would want or could do this, but she was so busy. And I said, but I asked her, and that was kind of the start. And I think she will say it started kind of like, oh, I'll do this one more project with Dr. Hayes, but she's still here, so tell us.
So I know many of you, but not all of you. I'm Dr. Marysia Tweed, a colleague of Dr. Hayes, who's been for a very long time, over a decade, a mentor, but a sponsor, I would say, and just a good friend, and I'm very grateful for this. And she is correct. I don't know if it was 2009 maybe, that she approached me to do research on SCAD, and of course I had to PubMed it and look online and update myself as a resident in internal medicine. And I thought it was going to be a year-long project. I do it, I finish, I move on, go into private practice. Wasn't even sure if I was going to go into cardiology at that point, and I'm still here. So I got sucked in, hook, line, sinker, everything, and ended up finishing residency at Mayo Clinic, then went on to cardiology fellowship at Mayo Clinic, did 3 years of that, and then did 2 additional years of advanced cardiac imaging training and was credentialed in that, and then stayed on staff. And I've been on staff at Mayo Clinic as a cardiologist now going over 5 years. It's hard to say out loud. And as part of that, I had a Birch grant through the NIH, which focused on SCAD, primarily focused on echocardiographic findings. The manuscripts are now starting to come to fruition. And currently have an NIH-funded K-23 grant, which is a 5-year grant, again with the focus of studying mechanisms in SCAD, specifically looking at the neurovascular system. So I would not have been able to tell you 10 years ago or 12 years ago that that's where I would end up. But it's been a wonderful journey. And I said this at the Minnesota Walk, once you start studying SCAD and working with individuals who've unfortunately suffered SCAD or have had a family who's had SCAD, it's hard to walk away. You can't. There's so much that needs to be learned, and it's not something I can abandon even when I feel busy. And I love everybody I've encountered in the process.
So we're going to tell you a few updates. I'll make sure that we feel interconnected, as you heard, Mayo and SCAD Research, Inc., and we have been here at the National every year since 2012, that first time. Come visit us at Mayo Clinic if you haven't already. Those are the Mayo brothers in the front of the building in which Dr. Tweet and I work. And we do feel that our collaboration with SCAD Research has afforded us a way to really learn how to care for SCAD patients. And both of us would admit that that is imperfect because of the lack of the knowledge base, but also it is a place where people find the kinds of answers. I will just say, just this week, I had a patient, and in her cath report, which did not diagnose the SCAD that she had, this is a very strange case. That was a quote from the cardiologist. I can tell you, no patient, man, woman, SCAD patient, cancer patient, any pen patient wants to be a strange case. And what we really are striving for is that SCAD is not a strange case, that every cardiologist recognizes it and does the appropriate thing. Just a few more just fun pictures of our team. We'll see others, but Dr. Galati there, who is really somebody who's very integral, has been there since the beginning. He is an interventional cardiologist who, if you are part of our research, he has looked at your angiogram, and I can kind of honestly say he's probably looked at more SCAD angiograms than anybody in the world. And then a few new folks, and we're going to talk about the research. That's Dr. Nabila Boutaya. I always don't get her name completely right. She's French. She is studying, she's a geneticist in France, and we have collaborated on an international basis that has allowed us to do that because of the funds that we have gotten. And there, you heard about Bob. So literally, this appeared on the front page of our intranet. It's on the news page, and it was a rotating thing. And so people would say, I didn't know you guys were doing that. So a little background. So why do we do what we do? And I think sometimes, patients say, well, you're doing it so you can get answers, my answers. But it's a big process. And so we want to both get answers for you, but we want to disseminate that knowledge to other people. It's all well and good for us to be experts about SCAD, but if the cardiologist in your community does not know how to diagnose it, that we have not done our job. And so I think that's a lot of what we do. So we design and conduct research. We use the data from our registries, but increasingly some prospective studies. It's really important in the scientific process that we present our data at meetings, that we get up and we put a poster. And when we talk about posters at scientific meetings, it isn't like a poster to, elect me for student council. It actually is sort of a visual representation of one of our studies. We post it or we present it electronically, and our colleagues in our field can learn about it, can ask us questions. They poke holes in it, makes our research better. So that's really important. We talk about it to patients as well. Once we do that, we then want the peer review. Publishing it in journals, particularly cardiology journals, is important because that's how we spread the word. But it's also important, and we've really taken it to heart, where we've published in emergency medicine journals. We've published it in OB-GYN, for maternal health journals. We've published it in radiology journals. So all the aspects of SCAD in different specialties who are looking at this problem might be engaged and perhaps better. Share in social media, maybe not as much as, but you can help us with that. One of the things that both Dr. Tweet and I have been really committed to, starting with Dr. Tweet, but to mentor others so that the next generation of radiologists and gynecologists and cardiologists are interested in this, and we plant the seed. And we've got folks that we mentored as medical students who are now emergency medicine doctors. And so what that does is that's a whole, I wish we'd kept them in cardiology. But what it means is that they will continue in their own specialty. We collaborate with others. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but we've really been an important part because our DNA biobank of SCAD patients is the largest in the world. And so for some of these international collaborations, through the support of SCAD research, we've been able to contribute more samples than anybody else and fill the knowledge gaps. So, little history, you heard, SCAD patients approached me. We got together, decided how are we going to even do this? It's a rare disease. I was taught in cardiology school. You can't study this, so we tried to figure out a way. We presented the first 12 patients, and at least one of those 12 patients is in the room tonight. This was like a beta test. Can we even study this rare disease how do you recruit people? Then we opened for more, our first IRB, and that's where you get the permission from your organization for safety. We applied for 100 patients. We said, wow, we'd be so lucky if we recruited 100 patients. And now we have over 1,500 and actually are selectively recruiting to our registry at this point. And so we do survey data, we look at angiograms and images, and we're continually incorporating new data and questions as we learn. Now, we wanted to talk a little bit about, and most of these have been with Dr. Tweet, but we've done things where they're big review articles. Review articles important. It may not be new science, but it's a new audience. So that the spontaneous coronary artery with Dr. Louie being, first of all, she's not a Mayo physician. She's actually at Penn. And I asked her to be a part of this because it broadens it. And this was an article that talked to generalists, which is really important, not just cardiologists that know about it. We've got the sort of routine with Dr. Escala.
Yep, correct. And he is going into interventional cardiology, I believe, but he's a trainee at Mayo Clinic and wanted to write up a case. He presented it at the AHA scientific sessions and then followed through, wrote the case, helped guide him in how to do that, and it was published in a good cardiology journal where I'm sure a lot of people have seen it.
And I think the one at the top there is increasingly we are being asked to comment because we've been in this space. So when somebody else publishes an article, a Mayo group is asked to review that paper. Maybe we give feedback to make it a better paper, but also to write a commentary to put it in perspective. And we've increasingly been asked to do that. We've been collaborating with others. So this one here up at the top, that is with a large study called Virgo. Virgo was a big study looking prospectively at heart attacks and disproportionately looked at women. And I remember asking the senior author there, Dr. Krumholtz, I said, how many SCAD patients do you have in this database? And he said, I don't think very many. And I said, yes, you do. You need to review those angiograms. And since that, over several years, we've had 2 publications that have come out from that group because they had a unique population of patients that we can then bring value to for the knowledge about SCAD. I'll let you talk about it.
So Dr. Tarabaccia and Dr. Tan are both trainees that I've worked with. Dr. Tarabaccia is currently doing his ICU fellowship, and Dr. Tan is completing his heart rhythm fellowship. And this was just another project where they came to me and said, have you looked at this with patients who've had SCAD? And I said, no, but are you willing to look into it with me? You know, I don't have the bandwidth, but I'm happy to mentor you and guide you. So this was a manuscript that came out of that work and was also presented at scientific meetings along the way, and then it was published, just giving additional insight and trying to answer questions that haven't been looked at yet.
Yeah. So this one we're really excited. So in Minnesota we said forthcoming, but because it was published last week in Nature Genetics, which is a very high impact journal. Now we're not even going to describe what these pictures mean. Actually, neither one of us is the expert in what these pictures mean. I think the impact is, so this was it was published in Nature Genetics, which is very high impact genetics. And this was one of those international, England, France, Australia, Mount Sinai, University of Michigan, UCLA, Vancouver General, and Mayo Clinic. We provided over a quarter of the samples of all of those groups. And I think we're not going to go into this, but what's exciting about this is the collaboration and that we can lead in this space, but also that we are identifying, there is no SCAD gene, there is no FMD gene. We've established that a decade ago. But what we are seeing is that there are some mutations that are common in the general population, but they are more common in patients with SCAD. And it may be that if we collect and develop enough of these, that we will be able to do what is called a polygenic risk score. What that means is we might test a patient for dozens of genes that have been associated with a risk of SCAD or fibromuscular dysplasia. And we might be able to tell that individual, hey, you're low risk for a recurrence, or you're relatively high risk. We really don't think you should have another baby. Right now, we kind of tell everybody the same thing because we don't have that risk stratification. And I do think that some of these genetics will be important. And I think the other novel thing is that it does appear that people who have SCAD and the genes that may be associated with SCAD may be at lower risk for future development of atherosclerosis or plaque, and vice versa. Those who don't have those genes that are associated are at higher risk. We are at the very beginning of this research, but I think it's really important that, one, Mayo cannot do this by ourselves, and that we have great international collaborations.
And just to add the advantage, and granted it is very early in the research and requires a lot of work for validation and ensuring that, you know, we're in the right direction, but it's also helpful for families, you know, thinking about this polygenetic risk score and applying that to family members as well. So that is kind of where that direction is headed, and hopefully that will keep going and being successful.
Yeah, for instance, if you had a patient, and we have so many patients that are worried about their children or their siblings. You know, I have daughters, they're about to get pregnant, or what testing should I do? And I would love to be able to say, right now we say there really isn't any testing that we would recommend, but it would be great if we had something that was validated to put people peace of mind. But it may be that some of those individuals, we would say, these individuals are at higher risk. Maybe they shouldn't be running marathons. Maybe, you know, some of those things that are higher risk behaviors. So we're excited about this. It's on the 5 to 10 year plan, I think, but we wanted to share tonight because it literally is hot off the press. It was published online 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, the other advantage is trying to understand the why And as you understand what genes are involved and what mechanisms they interact with or help, control in conjunction with the environment, it might help us understand why better.
Because some genes are in the vessel wall. Some genes are in the heart muscle. Some genes are in the kidney. So, or in that. And so that helps us better understand. And this is just one, it's a graphic that we showed, but this was earlier research published in 2019, but also with a Mayo collaboration. And basically, the gene, a single gene, and if you had one version of the gene, you were more likely to have SCAD, more likely to be a woman, and more likely to have FMD. If you had the other version of the gene, you were more likely to be a man and have atherosclerosis. That's very intriguing. We don't understand completely, but we are looking for more of that sort of thing. So let's get back a little to the basics, because we probably have some people in the room or some people online. So remember what SCAD is. It's a tear. It's a bleeding event. It's a tear of the layers between the heart wall arteries, the wall of the arteries, and it isn't plaque. It can look like plaque on an angiogram, and we know that sometimes it can be missed. What also do we know in 2023? So the average age, kind of middle-aged women, 42 to 52. We often say it's young women, and we do have women in their teens that have had this, but women in their 70s and 80s can have SCAD as well. So if you look at the median, it's in that 40 to 50. It is a women's condition, 90% women. So if you think about men with SCAD, and we will talk a little bit about that later, if you talk about a rare condition, it's even rarer, and we know even less about men who have a SCAD. Very rarely familial. And one of the things you may have read about previously is, people don't have cardiac risk factors. Well, actually, they can, like hypertension and diabetes. And actually, hypertension is probably pretty much the same prevalence as in the general population. Not every patient who has a SCAD has a pure risk factor profile, and I think that's also, we're learning about that. It's not rare. All of you know it's much more common than we thought, particularly those of you who had your SCAD many years ago and were told it's the first one I've ever seen by your doctor, it only happens in pregnant people. But it's more common, and it's the number one cause of heart attack in women under the age of 50. Anything else you want to? I think reminding everyone that this is predominantly a heart attack. We are actually preparing a manuscript about a few cases where patients were diagnosed with SCAD who never reached the point of having a heart attack, but that's what it is. And we sometimes have patients who are worried, well, maybe I had SCAD, and we can pretty confidently say if they never had a heart attack, they probably did not have a SCAD. We've learned through Mayo research and others that doing what we typically do for a heart attack, putting a stent in, is not always the right thing to do for patients with SCAD, because the artery may be fragile, and we might actually do more harm than good. And we also know the good news is SCAD often heals without treatment, which is another reason not to go in and put some hardware in there. I'll let you talk about.
Yes, this is exciting. Dr. Alexis Johnson is now on the West Coast. She was a Mayo medical student who reached out, I think, to Dr. Hayes, and I had the opportunity to work with her as well as a co-mentor, and awesome individual, very passionate about this work, and now is essentially getting towards the end of her emergency medicine training to be an ER doctor, and one of the first people to see patients who present with SCAD. And she did a couple of papers with us. One of her first ones was looking at mental health and PTSD, but this particular paper, we focused on presentation in the emergency department as it was relevant to her as well in her clinical work. And I think one of the first findings that we found interesting and important to report is about 20% of the patients that we studied had an initial first troponin that was normal. And if you think about the ER and their practice, if a patient has minimal to no risk factors and the first troponin is normal, they have a scoring system where they sometimes say, okay, not a heart attack, you can go. It's low likelihood that you'll go on to have a heart attack. This just emphasizes...
And they send them out of the hospital.
Correct. This emphasizes that,
1 in 5 who are going to go on and have that heart attack Me.
Yeah, you should check again and watch these patients. And I think that was very important to make, and this was published in the ER journal, to make emergency physicians aware of and be on their radar and pause to think before sending on a patient, particularly if they have symptoms of heart attack. So the other notations here include that the chest symptom of some kind was very common, over 80% of patients. A quarter had nausea or vomiting, and then a subset has shortness of breath or sweating. So these are symptoms that you classically think about with heart attack.
They are not atypical.
So in other words, again, helpful for the ER physician. You know, if you have a patient who doesn't have risk factors and maybe their first troponin is normal, but they're having the symptoms that are consistent with a heart attack, you do not send them home. You watch them and you continue to check their troponins.
Yeah, that's a big point that we like, because one of the reasons that SCAD is sometimes missed is typical symptoms, atypical patient. And we have to help our colleagues overcome the biases that might say, well, they have the classic symptoms of a heart attack, but they don't look like a heart attack patient, so I think they can go home and we'll work them up as an outpatient. And we've seen that a lot, and I think that that's one of the things that it's research that can, because if we say we don't think you should do that, that's not going to fly, but when we can back it up with data. So we said we'd talk a little bit about men. These are data from Dr. Tweet, but as well as from the Canadian group. So men come in with the same symptoms on average. They tend to be younger than women who have SCAD. They're less likely to have fibromuscular dysplasia and migraine headaches, but they are more likely to have exercise as their trigger, less likely than women to have emotional triggers. And they seem to do better in terms of coming back with lots of chest pain after a SCAD than women do. But long-term outcomes are very similar. So I think it still remains an understudied group, and we are very interested in expanding our research on men with SCAD. So let's transition a little bit into not what the research is showing, but kind of what are we telling patients in clinic? Early on, you all have heard, and some of you curse about beta blockers. And I like to share the rationale. So the level of evidence for the recommendation for beta blockers is not strong. I tell patients that. But there is an observational study that would say that those who their doc prescribed them beta blockers were less likely to have a recurrence. That study also said that people with high blood pressure were more likely to. So it is possible that it isn't the beta blocker, it's getting the blood pressure down with any medication. We don't know that, and we have not actually replicated. But in general, I like to see patients on a beta blocker for a year if they'll tolerate it. But remember, the level of evidence isn't so strong, so I don't just stomp my foot and say you have to be on one.
Yes, and as many have found, you can talk to several cardiologists, even SCAD expert cardiologists, and you can get a variety of answers. And so, for example, I probably am a little more hardcore about pushing the beta blocker, but I don't have any more data than Dr. Hayes does regarding that recommendation. And some of it depends on patient preference and what works for them as well. So we work through a lot of that in clinic.
But we do really want a normal blood pressure. So the goal would be less than 120/80, and we tell patients that on average in Western society, women's blood pressure goes up between the ages of 60 and 70. And so I tell them, your blood pressure is 98 now, but that does not mean you are immune from hypertension in the future. And when you become hypertensive, we're going to be even more aggressive for you than anybody else. Statins we don't use routine. Remember, this is a split in the artery. It's not due to plaque buildup that statins. But we still use statins in patients who have really high cholesterol, who we would otherwise treat even if they hadn't had a SCAD. People sometimes ask us, like, is there a SCAD drug or is there a cocktail? And really the medications that we recommend beyond what we've talked about is for something else, like you need to be on 2 antiplatelet agents if you get a stent. If you have heart failure, there's a number of medications. So it's more about the associated conditions, not because of SCAD. If you have chest pain, we give you medication for that. We do generally recommend that you not take hormones, whether that's oral contraceptives, transdermal contraceptives or postmenopausal hormone therapy. And triptan medications, which are often used for migraines, they cause vasoconstriction. That's actually how they work for migraines. And it's well known that there can be cardiac complications for those. Now, the reason I point this out, and we make a point of it, is migraines are more prevalent in patients with SCAD and patients with fibromuscular dysplasia. So there's more of the patients who are already on triptans. And so what we tell patients is, yeah, we're going to take away that medication that may be working very well for you, but fortunately, just in the past 3 or 4 years, there are some migraine headache medications advertised up the wazoo on TV, but some of them are really quite effective. And so we recommend you see a headache doctor, a specialist who can work through that. Anything?
So some feedback we've gotten is a lot of our talks focus on SCAD. This is a SCAD walk. But as you have learned, and some of you may have, is fibromuscular dysplasia is very common in patients who've had SCAD. And so commonly we'll see these together. As shown, we think they're even on the same spectrum of disease when it comes to the genetic vulnerability or propensity. So we just decided to review a couple basics about fibromuscular dysplasia as well, because it is relevant. So just defining it, just as we do with SCAD, it's a disease of the arteries where the arterial wall is abnormal. So there's a risk of aneurysm or dissection in the arteries elsewhere. And there are several subtypes, but the most common subtype that we've observed with patients who have SCAD is called multifocal fibromuscular dysplasia, or FMD, where actually it's the middle portion, the media of the artery that's abnormal, with alternating changes. So you get what we call this string of beads in appearance on the imaging. And typically imaging is the way we diagnose it. So for any of those who, for example, have been in our Mayo Clinic SCAD clinic, and we'll talk about this in another slide, generally do at least one-time imaging of the head, neck, abdomen, and pelvis, because this is such a common concurrent entity, and also it is important to rule out any clinically significant aneurysms or dissections elsewhere. Just like SCAD, FMD is not due to plaque or inflammation. It's an entirely different process. There are other associated symptoms that we can commonly see in patients who have SCAD as well. So there's a lot of overlap: high blood pressure, headaches, migraines, pulsatile tinnitus, which is essentially that whooshing in your ear, patients who hear their heartbeat in their ear. That's very common in patients who've had FMD. And I've heard it from patients who have SCAD that maybe don't have imaging evidence of FMD, but have a lot of what we call tortuosity or curliness in the arteries. This is an example of fibromuscular dysplasia in the iliac arteries, and we're bringing up this slide because in 2012, nobody knew this association existed, and before that time. And we did an initial study in 2012 reporting the Rochester Epidemiology Project experience in SCAD. And Dr. Galati was reviewing all the angiograms again for that study. It was 87 patients. It got into a major cardiology journal, Circulation, which is a good journal for our field, because it was the largest series out there. Series on SCAD to that point, if it didn't include atherosclerosis, were no larger than 20 to 30 patients. And during that time, when he was looking at the angiograms, some people had a closure device, and they actually in the cath lab did imaging of the artery, and he noticed that half of the people who had that had fibromuscular dysplasia, and that association was made at that time. And then similarly, around the same time, Dr. Sa, who's also heavily involved in SCAD and FMD patients, was observing that there's a subset of her FMD patients who were going on to have SCAD. And so from both ends, and nearly around the same time, the articles were, I think, within months of each other in the literature, that association of SCAD and fibromuscular dysplasia was made, but it wasn't known before then. And again, helpful for trying to understand why the two exist.
And so that's that string of pearls, string of beads. It's kind of both of these cases are pretty prominent, but it was striking that 50%, and we all just kind of scratched our head, and then it was observed by another organization, and we said, well, this is probably, it is an association. People say, did it cause it? I think in our hearts of hearts, we say fibromuscular dysplasia is probably a cause and probably a major cause of SCAD, but it has not reached causality in medicine and in research is a very high bar, and we haven't quite proven that yet, but I think that clearly associated.
And we won't spend too much time on this, but we do have a couple of papers where we focused and looked at this. One in particular was, she's now a cardiologist, but where we looked at 115 SCAD clinic patients with comprehensive CTs and looked at how many had abnormalities in the arteries elsewhere. And when we looked at those series of studies where we re-looked at all the images, like we had Dr. Vertiska, even if one of our own radiologists read it, she looked at each one herself in detail. 66% of that subset had some kind of arterial abnormality.
So 2/3.
Yep, and then 45% met criteria, imaging diagnostic criteria for multifocal FMD. And there was a wide anatomic distribution, so lots of arteries involved. We actually had radiologists come to us and ask to look at this closer because they were noticing it clinically when they were doing all these studies. They're like, we need to take a closer look at this. So they two radiologists reviewed 214 studies. So they're re-reviewing studies that were already done with this in mind, focusing on the neck. And then this is just kind of the series of findings that they noted. And they published this in one of their radiology journals to disseminate to their own colleagues. And only 14% of patients had plaque, the majority of which was just mild, a little bit of plaque. Nobody had a severe atherosclerotic plaque or stenosis related to it.
So I think the summary is that most people who have had a SCAD have some type of abnormality in other arteries, and the number one abnormality that we find is fibromuscular dysplasia. But the important things that we might want to screen for and treat or follow are, say, a brain aneurysm or another dissection in another artery. And that's why we recommend this imaging. It can be CT angiogram or MR angiogram. Ultrasound is insufficient for the screening. And we still see patients who, they get a carotid ultrasound or a renal ultrasound, artery ultrasound, and they say, oh, you don't have FMD. Well, I'll say, the point is not to rule out FMD. It's, do you have another abnormality that might require either treatment or follow-up, like an aneurysm in your artery to your spleen or a brain aneurysm. So I do think that having this cross-sectional imaging is important. And the other thing is, I don't think we can actually rule out fibromuscular dysplasia with the imaging that we currently do. First of all, CT is not as sensitive as we might like. And we're only doing the kind of important arteries, the head and neck and abdomen and pelvis. We're not doing arms and legs. And you could, and we have patients who have had completely normal imaging, but had clear evidence of fibromuscular dysplasia in their arm when they had their radial artery. So I think it's important that that's not the purpose. And in fact, we believe that many patients who may even have a normal scan may have fibromuscular dysplasia. But it's important you get this. And I think it's important to those who are out there because sometimes cardiologists think it doesn't need to be done. What would be the point? We don't usually treat FMD. No, the point is if you had FMD but also had a brain aneurysm, we would perhaps treat that. So that's the rationale for that.
I think it may be helpful to hear because I think if I was sitting in that chair, maybe I just had a SCAD diagnosis, I'd start getting nervous. That in our anecdotal experience and even in the literature that is out there, patients with fibromuscular dysplasia and history of SCAD, we have found that even on the patients we're monitoring, there's not a lot of change. Mm-hmm. And some patients do need intervention, but that is uncommon. And so I just want to emphasize that because I have many, many patients who've had SCAD who do have FMD or aneurysms that we're following. And
maybe 1 in 100 really we need to follow up. So it's a reassuring thing and I think patients are waiting, do I have FMD? And I'm like, I'm walking into the room saying, I'm assuming you have FMD. I'm just looking for some bad actor that I need to deal with. And I think that's, and kind of looking at it that way. The other thing we deal with a lot is after SCAD, lots of patients, particularly women, have chest pain. And it might be chest pain that feels like they're having another heart attack. It might be hyper-awareness of their chest, all sorts of things, often for weeks to months after they have their heart attack. And so this is scary to patients. It's actually a higher prevalence than people who have a regular atherosclerotic heart attack. And it's something that we deal with a lot. And I think you patients who, maybe you made 2 or 3 ED visits after you had your heart attack because you had more symptoms. But most of the time, it tends to settle down. I think the important message that I give patients is that just because it is common, it is not normal. It needs an evaluation. And I've had too many patients who've had severe chest discomfort going on for weeks or months, and they've never had a blood test. Their doc has said, oh, we've heard that it's really normal to have chest pain after SCAD. It's common, it's treatable, and it should be evaluated. And that can be done in a number of ways with stress tests and imaging.
Dr. Hayes spoke earlier about kind of the research and the clinical practice, and since the Mayo Clinic SCAD practice started, what year did the SCAD clinic start? Was it 2012?
But we started seeing, 2012, we started seeing SCAD patients.
Officially, I mean, I forget the last count, but we're easily over over 200 to 300 a year of patients with SCAD. And interestingly, both her and I were meeting with a lot of patients who had angina-related SCAD. Menstrual-related angina, where patients were noting their angina with their menstrual cycle. And both of us spoke and realized we were both hearing it, so we did write a paper on it. Mechanistically, there is some explanation for it, but again, just highlighting, one, the utility of interacting with patients who've actually lived and experienced SCAD, informing the research, and then the research informing the practice. This is one of those key examples. But it also is common, and there's ways to approach treatment that are unique to that problem, and also don't just call it normal and live with it, I think is...
Yeah, I think the other thing that we came is so many of these women who said, we'd seen dozens of patients who had experienced that, I get way worse chest pain the 2 days before I have my period. And we heard it so often, and they said, my cardiologist told me there was no such thing. So that's part of why we wrote we said, well, we're going to write it up so at least we can point to a paper in the literature that it's a thing. And it actually was described not just with SCAD, but even with heart attacks of the regular kind. But I think that's where, in an uncommon, getting back, in an uncommon condition, to getting the word out in peer-reviewed journals can help with care of patients all over.
So I think we covered this, but just kind of an overview is, I've gotten emails from people I don't know, hey, I've had a SCAD, I have chest pain, what do you think? And it's not as simple as that. Really, when it comes to evaluation of these symptoms, whether it be chest pain or something else, it has to be an individualized approach. Sometimes it's a multifactorial contribution. Sometimes we don't understand why. And you had mentioned weeks to months. Unfortunately, I've had patients who suffer with this for even years, or they're good for a while and then start having issues again. I think this just lists some of the approaches. These are the cardiac-focused approaches, but there are also non-cardiac approaches to this as well.
And it's important because if you've had a heart attack, of course, your mind goes immediately to your heart. But people have heartburn, they have chest wall pain, and it's important to identify what's going on, because obviously treating a muscle spasm in the chest wall is very different than treating a blockage in a coronary artery. And that's where listening to patients is just really important.
So another focus of our work has been looking at pregnancy-associated SCAD, and there is reason for concern. We reported this data, which has been consistent with other data reported. This was, I think, the largest series at the time, or one of the largest series, where we observed that patients who had pregnancy-associated SCAD presented more sick. They had more vessels, so more than one artery having SCAD at the same time, more severe heart attacks, cardiogenic shock. These were not uncommonly older mothers who had already had prior pregnancies. There was some suggestion that they were more likely to have infertility treatments, but that's a chicken or egg question. Suggestion that they were more likely to have history of preeclampsia. And the other important findings is you can see the time course here, that the majority of the patients were after delivery in that first month. And of those patients in that first month, about half of them were in the first week after delivery, which is a time that, it wasn't just people who had vaginal deliveries, by the way. It was also those who had C-sections. But there's a time of a lot of hemodynamic fluctuation as well as hormonal fluctuation. And so we consider that a very vulnerable time, and that's important for counseling. But as you can see, it's also occurred during pregnancy and then later after in the postpartum period.
So our recommendation, and most of you know, is that we do recommend against pregnancy. It's a higher risk time, but that recommendation lands very differently. If you're a 45-year-old woman, you've had 3 kids, you really weren't planning another one. In fact, you were on birth control, to the 19-year-old college student who doesn't have a boyfriend. Those are 2 very different. And we hope with the research that we perhaps can figure out who may be at higher risk for having a pregnancy complication and those who may be lower risk, so that not everyone. I can just tell as a cardiologist, and I've had several patients who've gone through pregnancies, it's that month to 6 weeks after birth, that's when this cardiologist gets heartburn and chest pain, because I tell patients, often we cardiologists are asked to advise about the risk of pregnancy in patients with valve disease or with other types of heart conditions. Often we know a lot about the effect on those conditions of the pregnant state. What I say is the S in SCAD is spontaneous. It is unpredictable. There are no tests. There's no stress test that we can do. There's no blood test that we can do to predict that. And so we do talk to patients who may think that they want to have a child. I want both partners there. I want to talk to both of them, particularly if they have another child or children, to think about that risk. Is it worth it to go forward? I think it's important, though, that we doctors, in the absence of data, don't just dogmatically say, you need to get your tubes tied, or you can never have a child, because I think that these are the kinds of difficult discussions that for some people, their values would be such that this is the most important thing, this is something that I was meant to have, and even if it means a risk for me in my life, I want to go forward. And that's where finding the right healthcare team and the heart team, the heart OB team, to help carry through with that. So we do preconception counseling. We have a colleague, Dr. Carl Rose at Mayo, who is a maternal fetal medicine person, that if somebody comes to us, that we refer to them. And then we get that cardio OB team.
Yep.
So just talking about some other things that affect patients after SCAD that may be a little different from other types of heart attacks or cardiac disease. So, you know, the age of SCAD, a lot of these individuals are premenopausal, and we put them on blood thinners, and so they have really, really heavy periods, some of them, enough to make them anemic. Well, most cardiologists who don't specialize in this, they don't see a lot of premenopausal women who are on dual antiplatelet therapy, and so a lot of times they don't even ask. And so we all have patients who really should at least be taking iron, or we should be thinking about. So I think that there are some unique features, particularly about women, but there are some safe alternatives like certain IUDs that can be planted that both prevent pregnancy but also bleeding. Migraine management, we mentioned that can be tricky because it's more common in SCAD patients, and it's also, we take away one of the main drugs that has been effective. We're very interested and know how important the psychosocial burden is. You know, I will say that when I sit in an exam room with a woman with a baby in a baby carrier or a stroller with a fresh sternotomy scar from her bypass surgery, those are things that not only wound the body, but wound the soul. And clearly this is a high-risk group for whom a horrible event that came out of the blue, and how one goes on, particularly when their doctors are saying, I have no idea what's going on. You're a very strange case. So that is an interest both in better understanding that experience, but better supporting patients through that. And then, you know, I've had patients talk about just the loss of sense of self, the loss of reproductive options is also something that we have to consider. That's a little, you know, we consider that in a lot of different cardiac conditions, but it's much more common.
Yeah, even when we think about people who've been extremely athletic,
Yeah.
or, you know, weightlifters or marathon runners, or those who maybe do sports or hobbies like scuba diving that may be considered risky. And
D1
then,
athletes.
correct. And then you're saying, maybe you should scale back or not do that. That's a loss.
Yeah.
You know, a lifetime loss, or at least always negotiating the risks that are kind of known but not fully known or data supported versus the pros when it comes to quality of life and self-identity. And that's a tough balance.
So that's an interest, and we now have a recent faculty member whose her interest is, she's a psychiatrist, and her interest is in cardiopsychiatry, and particularly in women and minoritized communities. And we've looking at how we can better explore that now that we have some expertise. What you talk about physical activity. So we alluded to it. So I'll just start by, because about a quarter of SCADs, people reflect back and there was a trigger of either extreme emotional or physical stress, we've kind of given a blanket recommendation is don't exercise super hard. But what's the evidence? And that's one of the things we've been trying to build on.
And that's actually very difficult to build on, because as I tell patients in clinic, it's not like you're going to put a lot of patients or persons with history of SCAD in a room, have them exercise, and see who has another problem. You know.
Let's take half of them and send them on and train them for a marathon, and the other half we'll just do a walking program. And that's probably not a study we're going to be able to do.
You know, so then it comes down to a lot of observational data and mechanisms, thinking through mechanisms of why certain things happen, and observations essentially, and experiences, and then also an individual weighing the pros and cons for themselves. You know, how important is this to me, and what level of risk am I comfortable with? But this particular paper, I've always been excited and happy about. You know, it started out really long, and the journal told us to shorten it, and then I had it as a review, and they're like, there's not much data, you have to make this more like a viewpoint opinion. But the co-authors here are myself and Dr. Hayes. Dr. Olin is a SCAD and FMD expert that we know very well at Mount Sinai. Dr. Banikowski, she's one of our cardiac rehab directors who is very interested in SCAD, and we're continually talking about the next project. And then Dr. David Adlam, we've collaborated with him, as well as Dr. Olin on the genetics research, but also on some other projects. And he's in the UK and a SCAD and FMD expert. So we spoke together and came to a consensus of what we tell our patients and what we think makes a lot of common sense. Some of that includes looking at rehab, which we think even up to 1 to 2 weeks after SCAD is feasible, but overall is considered safe, can improve stress and depression, and that's been shown in the data. We avoid competition, endurance type of things, high intensity activities or extreme temperatures, and that's based on anecdotal data and observational data. Strength training we're okay with, but lower resistance, higher reps, and really the goal is to avoid doing a prolonged or repeated Valsalva maneuver, which is essentially when you're bearing down and you're kind of holding your breath as you lift. That's essentially what we try to avoid.
And I'll just put a plug in for rehab, because I had 2 patients, SCAD patients I saw in the last week, both young, healthy-looking people. One actually asked for rehab, and her doctor said, I only send elderly patients to rehab, which goes against every guideline we have in our profession. Correct. So I'll just say. And another one also asked about it, and she wasn't told she wasn't old enough for rehab, but it is one, there is, and I will just say, I'll apologize in advance, because that actually, our guidelines for cardiologists in our professional guidelines would say every patient who has a qualifying event, and a heart attack is one, should be referred for cardiac rehab. But I think there is a bias against somebody who it looks healthy, oh, you could just go do that on your own. It's not about the physical reconditioning. It is important, but it is the becoming in a controlled and safe environment, confident in your own body again, that is so much a part of cardiac rehab after SCAD. Just because I could run a 10K before I had my heart attack does not mean that in a few weeks after that heart attack, I will be ready to do that again. Because I may be physically ready, but I am sure not ready up here. And that's what cardiac rehab. So I think that's a place where we can really advocate for better care. And one thing we know is that cardiac rehab is usually approved by insurance companies up to a year after an event. So if you hear of somebody who did not get referred, often, even if it's 8 months out and they still are interested in doing that. And one of the patients I saw last week said, yeah, I want a referral. So I did a referral back to another state because she did not have a local cardiologist who did that.
Yeah, the other common story is they didn't know what to do with me, or it was more work to climb the stairs to the rehab center than what they'd let me do because they were scared of what would happen. And so in those cases, is non-common. Dr. Banikowski, for example, has been a great resource where she's communicated with groups, so the patient tells them, can you reach out to Mayo Clinic, please? I've sent guidance, and papers to help the exercise physiologists and the cardiac rehab team that's local to kind of know how to guide their patient through it so that it's not, it's beneficial in regards to the physical and mental piece, and people aren't just saying, I don't know what to do. And this is just from that article we spoke about before, where essentially the graphic shows green, yellow, red. Green, which we recommend and encourage. Yellow is, these are things that, yes, you can do, but do it with caution, common sense, listen to your body. And avoid means big X, or at least know that we don't recommend it at this time based on observations of patients that we've cared for. And unfortunately, nobody wants to have a SCAD. Nobody wishes for another person to have a SCAD, but it is a demonstration that the arteries are prone to this phenomenon. And the concern is that unfortunately you could be prone to another one. So what are the conditions that we can try to optimize to try to reduce that likelihood as best possible based on the information we have?
So the next few slides, we're wrapping up now, is just kind of a summary. And again, this is some of the advice that we give, that some of it's based on data, but most of it not as strong as we'd like. But we talked about avoiding pregnancy and using non-hormonal contraception. Remember, blood pressure control. Normal blood pressure is considered less than 120/80. Hearts love a low blood pressure, brain maybe not so much. So it is a balance. We don't want it so low that people feel woozy and the like. But throughout the ages after SCAD, the most powerful stress on your artery is the pulse of each beat of your heart and that blood pressure, and so keeping that in the normal range. We talked about the triptans, providing psychological support to the patient and the family, and considering genetics. We didn't spend a lot of time, we'll talk a little bit again, but we can't send, let's test you for that SCAD gene. There's no such thing. I get questions all the time. Should I take a supplement? Should I eat a healthy diet? Is that going to make my SCAD better? We have no evidence. I would say eat a healthy diet because it's good for you. It prevents cancer and all sorts of other things, but it probably will not impact your SCAD risk. People worry about caffeine and alcohol at low, moderate use. Probably doesn't have any effect on, so if you'd like to have a glass of wine with dinner tonight, please do a cup of coffee in the morning. But if you have, after your SCAD, have had a severe heart pumping function problem, reduced ejection fraction, or heart failure, you may need to be advised not to drink at all. We talked about supplements. I get a lot of questions from the 35-year-old, well, what about when I go through menopause? Is that a higher risk? We don't think that that is a higher risk time for recurrent SCAD. For one, doesn't show it from the data, can't say that.
We are looking at it again, though.
But we are looking at it.
We are. It's in a work in progress.
But if you look at the average age of SCAD, it tends to be lower. So if anything, hormones settle down. Symptoms may go up. People talk about the hot flashes. And so I think it signals, wow, that must be a time where things are going wild. If anything, the range, the up and down of hormones is starting to go lower, and estrogen levels go lower. We advise against using postmenopausal hormone therapy unless there are symptoms that cannot be controlled with non-hormonal therapy. Not because we definitely know that hormone therapy is risky, but we don't know. And we know there's something going on hormonally since 90% are women and the pregnancy. So I think that if somebody is unable to sleep or work because of postmenopausal symptoms, certainly seeing a menopausal specialist who works with cardiologists. We're very fortunate to have a women's health clinic and actually a couple of individuals in that group who are interested in seeing SCAD patients to talk through what are the options, because I think we just prefer that. And the other question we often get is vaginal estrogen is generally perceived as safe. We did get asked and answered the question about sex after SCAD at the Minnesota. I'm happy to do that here.
I turned that to Dr. Hayes.
The one thing I would say, and this is from old and still, is having intercourse with a spouse or stable partner takes about the same energy as mopping the floor. That does not sound sexy. And it does go against all those, CSI where they find somebody after, having intercourse and they're dead in the bed from a heart attack. I would just say that this is something that don't be afraid to talk to your cardiologist about this or your partner about developing loving and safe ways to have, to go forward with things that are very important for intimacy. There is really no reason that you can't. And we even have patients with severe heart failure who don't have SCAD, who can go forward and have a loving relationship. So it is something that sometimes is very scary, right, for both. You may be ready, but your partner isn't because they don't want to give you a heart attack. So no, we talk about this, and I've heard it all, and I think that being able to talk about your fears and actually having objective data, because if you can go 10 minutes on a stress test, I think you should be able to do kind of whatever you want in bed. So I'm just going on record there. And she did not want to take that question. Her children are in the room, so.
So, moving forward. Yeah, that is a topic that we don't talk about. It's somewhat taboo, even in clinic, right? I mean, it's not mentioned. We don't typically talk about it in presentations, but it was asked, so therefore Dr. Hayes kindly responded. But
it's a question that I always love when a patient, man or woman, asks me about it, because the most recent very earnest question, it was not a SCAD patient, it was a man who'd had a heart attack, and he really wanted to know. He was very frightened. He hadn't been given any advice. And I think we as a profession do not talk about it enough, which leaves patients to guess. And so what I'd encourage us is there are some data that would suggest when it might be safe or not. And it should not be a taboo, because it's an important part.
But moving on to recurrent SCAD, which is actually, I think, in many ways a more difficult topic, and is the source of the fear even about the prior question, because it is something that's been observed. And, going back to that paper we did in 2012, at that time, patients were being told it's a fluke, don't worry about it, go on, live your life, this will never happen again. And as we looked at their data, and I think this was the first paper, I know it's the first paper that reported recurrent SCAD that I'm aware of, we realized that's not the case. Patients were having more SCAD in the future. And we're refining how common that is as time goes on and more data is put out there. The initial numbers were very high, but those were small subgroups of patients, referral patients, and so there was a lot of bias there. As we have started to diagnose SCAD more often because we're recognizing it and we're following patients, we're getting a better ballpark of where that number is, and certainly I'm trying to understand the risks. So right now in our registry, I'll tell you at about 5 years, 15% of patients have another SCAD. If we look at our Rochester Olmsted County project, which has less bias because it's a population-based study, that's more about 10% at 5 years. The Canadian study reported a much lower number at about 3 years. It was, I think they reported 2.5% or something.
Per year, yeah.
But there's there's differences in how we define it as well, so that's a whole nother nuance. But I think in the blue here, 2 to 3% risk per year is accurate of what's being observed in several studies. Typically occurring in a different vessel. Very rarely, some patients will have 3 or 4, and I cautiously say 5, but it is not a common phenomenon in regards to going on to 3, 4, 5 or more, really. Stents and bypass, we've put this data out there. I think in 2014 was the first time we published on it. There's no protection from a recurrent SCAD, and that's largely because when it happens again, it does tend to occur in a different vessel. My theory is, for a lot of patients, when their SCAD heals, that changes the infrastructure of the artery. But
makes it stronger. If you've got a scar, when it heals, it's stiffer. So if anything, when it heals, we think it's a theory, but it doesn't tend to happen in the same artery. But I think there was this thing, if we put a stent in, then it'll prevent it from doing, or if we bypass it. But if you think about it, it's spontaneous. It happens in a different artery, neither of those approaches. So it's not that you shouldn't do those, but you shouldn't do those thinking you're going to somehow prevent a future SCAD.
So there is a lot of research going on at Mayo Clinic, and we're just going to touch on the high points. This is not comprehensive, because there's always things going on in the background that maybe aren't mature enough to say too much yet, because they're exploratory. But the biggest part of this is our Mayo Clinic SCAD Prospective Registry, and I just have to say thank you to all the patients who participated, or those who came up to Dr. Hayes and encouraged her to get this started, because really it's made a huge difference and has been practice changing. It's changed the field. from the scientific perspective even. Currently, we have over 1,500 patients where we've reviewed their angiograms, and we, being Dr. Galati and Dr. Best,
we look at them too, but they're the experts.
They're the ones who get to give the official, yes, no, and then those of you who participate, there's a lot of questionnaires, narratives. We're still working on refining the follow-up process. It's a big job to do. This includes incorporating data from the clinical practice in our SCAD clinic as well. And then, of course, there's a list of novel work that's ongoing. Some of this has been going for years and starting to get to the fruition process where we're able to analyze and understand the data. And then I'm excited just to tell you a little bit about this prospective SCAD neurovascular project. This is what the NIH is currently funding for myself, but this is a collaborative project, and actually I won't go too much into it, but a K23 is a career mentorship project. So I have mentors who are guiding me along the way, including someone who works at the NIH, someone who's an expert in the field of women's health who has since retired. I have a primary mentor who essentially leads the neurovascular lab at St. Mary's, which is our hospital in Rochester, where he's graciously collaborated with me and is funding a large portion of the logistics and part of the study, Dr. Matt Urban here. But essentially, the goal is to try to better understand the why. And I have a theoretical framework there based on our prior data. And we're comparing prospectively a series of studies to look at the neurovascular function, both vascular and autonomic function of patients who've had history of SCAD to controls. And we're just getting started with enrollment, and so far it's been going really well. So I'm very, very excited. And it's been fun because we've been engaging a whole new group of people who otherwise wouldn't know about SCAD. And as they learn more, they're really excited. And actually, a large portion of the Human Integrative Lab came to the Minnesota SCAD dinner and walk because they were excited to learn more. So I find that wonderful because the more people you engage in the different disciplines you engage, you start looking at things differently because a radiologist will ask the question or look at a different perspective than I would. And someone who does mechanistic studies on human physiology is going to look at a problem differently than I would. And so building those partnerships and working collaboratively is always exciting. And then Dr. Urban is a PhD in engineering and has a unique expertise in ultrasound and some of the novel approaches with ultrasound, including a technique called elastography. So he's also supporting a part of the project, doing some novel ultrasound imaging as part of this too that hasn't been done elsewhere.
So this is I just wanted we'll end up and then we'll ask for questions. So website, if anybody wants to share it, look at it. These are kind of most of the folks that are the primary, you've heard from us, you've heard us refer to Dr. Best and Dr. Galati. Dr. Guidasesi is a geneticist. Many of you may have met Dr. Tim Olson because he's come here and he retired last year. And we have leaned very heavily on new colleagues to take up the mantle. And then Sue Milbrandt, who is sitting over here, who's our study coordinator. We could not do this work without her. The study coordinator in any research is the person who interacts directly with participants and directly for us and helps us stay on the straight and narrow and get all the regulatory things done as well. And so we, again, are very gracious to be in your presence and are glad to be here. I think we now can take some questions from this audience. I know it's late. You've got a 5K tomorrow, right? But we're happy to take some questions from all of you. And I will look, I have the chat and see. I was asked to. I can get into it. I've been keeping track. So, but does anybody have questions? And we'll repeat it over the mic if you have any questions from the audience.
What is the SCAD recurrence compared to other heart attacks? How does that compare?
That's a tough question just because for other types of heart attacks, we actually, because literally there's hundreds of thousands that have been in clinical studies, we're better at risk stratification. So we have patients who we can say the likelihood, if you do these three things, that you will have another heart attack is very, very low, or gosh, we're really worried about this guy because he's got ongoing diabetes, he's smoking, he's got other unaddressed risk factors, and because of maybe even genetics or whatever, it's high. And one of the goals we have for SCAD is less to compare, is to be able to say, hey, you're at pretty low risk. We have enough data to say from genetics or whatever. So maybe you are somebody who goes on with your life. Maybe we do say you can liberalize your exercise or have a baby, whereas there may be others who we would watch a little more closely. And that's where it's not directly comparable. Honestly, the outcomes of patients with SCAD in the short and long term, as well as recurrence rates, tend to be lower, but it may just be because it tends to happen in younger, healthier people, as opposed to people who have a lot of other stuff going on.
Yeah, so this might not fully answer your questions, but the small studies that have compared SCAD patients looking at mortality data, like how long do they live, to patients who've had other types of heart attacks, the SCAD patients actually have better outcomes, and it's proposed because generally they don't have other comorbidities or quite as frequently, such as the tobacco use, which can increase the risk of atherosclerosis-related heart attacks 7 to 8 times in women, particularly, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. Those are small studies, and certainly I think it's a great question. It's hard to do a comparison of 2 different kinds of heart attacks, but yeah.
There's a question online, and I'll just read it. It's about treatment of aneurysms, and we usually refer patients who develop an aneurysm. First of all, it depends on where. It depends on the size and how fast it's growing. And so the treatment can be anything from surgical to doing a less invasive coiling procedure or just watching it over time. So there isn't a single best way, but we do recommend if patients have aneurysms, they've got a brain aneurysm, we send them to our neurovascular or neurosurgical or neurology colleagues. If they've got something in their abdomen, we send it to our vascular folks or interventional radiologists. So there are non-invasive or minimally invasive, not surgical, ways to treat those. Questions from here? I can go on with questions that we, from Megan, is there research on SCAD patients who needed a heart transplant? If it is genome, is it specific to the heart or can still happen in a donor heart? Great question. We would love to, every SCAD patient who ends up with such bad heart failure that their heart needs to be explanted so they can to get that heart and to be able to look at it and do DNA. See, do they have FMD in their arteries? Do they have something else going on? That is a difficult process, and I will say that fortunately, not that many people who have a SCAD end up with heart failure severe enough that they need a heart transplant. So that should be reassuring to most of you. But I guess what our gut would be is whatever caused the abnormality in the arteries, the fibromuscular dysplasia, we believe that probably emerges sometime after puberty, and that it would be something that affected your original heart, but if you had a normal heart with normal arteries put in it, then wouldn't affect that. That would be my...
Agreed, and that phenomenon that they asked about transplant heart then having SCAD, I don't think anything like that's been reported, but if you or you know someone where that's happened, we would be more than happy to look at that further and even write it up for the literature, so reach out to us, because that would be important for trying to understand the mechanism. Because if we think this is an architectural thing that has evolved over time due to a vulnerability of how the arteries are made to begin with, it would be perhaps paradigm changing to have a situation where a donor heart then goes through the same process from a mechanistic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually being considered as a living liver donor candidate. Having had a SCAD, what are your thoughts and heartburn on that? My cardiologist said for the Cleveland Clinic, but we're good and schedule it.
Can't comment on your individual standpoint, but I can't think about if your heart is healthy and you needed to do that there'd probably be a risk to the person who was the recipient or to you more than anyone else. There's several comments online about how great rehab was for them and how glad, even if they started late, that they were glad that they did it. one question is there research showing a connection between collagen and matrix deficiencies? And why wouldn't we want to take collagen supplements? So I think that first of all, oral collagen supplements are just broken down like any other protein in the gut and don't do anything for your fingernails or really anything else. So it's common, it's marketed. And the problems with collagen, and it's rare in SCAD, but collagen makes up the blood vessels. And so we do look, if we do genetic studies, for known collagen matrix abnormalities. And some of those genes that we have identified are in the collagen or in the blood vessel wall. But it is an abnormality of, there's not enough collagen there. It's that the collagen molecules are made incorrectly. So taking extra collagen would not be the approach. We don't know what the approach is. Probably going to be genetic, ultimately, down the road. Do you have anything else?
So I think that's been a hip question lately. So I got it a lot to the point that I reached out to one of our collagen aortic experts, asking him the same question, and his response was very much identical or similar to Dr. Hayes.
Yeah. I mean, it would be wonderful if we identified a pill, a supplement, a drug, an injection that somehow would correct the underlying abnormality of the artery that lets SCAD occur. And there may sometimes be that, but we imagine that because the underlying condition is in the structure of the muscle or the structure of the collagen, that it's going to be a fundamental change in one's muscle within. And really, there are no conditions, a lot that we're hoping, cystic fibrosis and others, where we're hoping to genetically modify tissue and a living person. None of them are really ready for prime time at this point. Other questions? Yeah.
So the lovely part about working at Mayo is we work with a lot of different trainees, and they tend to be all-stars. So I, not uncommonly, will give a presentation about SCAD to residents or fellows or other trainees. And so I was given a general talk about SCAD to a group of internal medicine residents for one of their core lecture series. And one was going into rheumatology, and she came up to me afterwards and asked me that question. And so together we did a project along with some others looking at autoimmune disease, and we focused on the population of Olmsted County to try to have as unbiased of a look at it as possible. And what we found was the prevalence of autoimmune disease was no different between SCAD patients to matched controls, and we matched according to age and gender and a few other factors. And that suggested that, yes, SCAD patients can have autoimmune disease, but we don't think that's the primary driver, so we wouldn't, for example, screen everyone with autoimmune disease. At that time, Dr. Turley, who was doing a lot of work on SCAD genetics, and she essentially based her whole PhD on that work. We had her take a look at what we were finding in the SCAD genetics realm and look at what's been published in the rheumatology world. And again, there was not really an overlap like what we see with SCAD and FMD. So perhaps if someone's having a lupus flare, that could be a stressor contributing to SCAD, but we haven't been screening everyone for autoimmune disease.
And remember that most of the autoimmune lupus and others, they're much more common in women, as is SCAD. And so it was always, you can have a condition and they get another condition, and are they causal or just coincidence? And the study would suggest that, yes, there are people who have these conditions that may have a SCAD, but if they don't already have symptoms or a diagnosis, we don't need to go looking for that. Does that make sense? It was about 12% in both populations had it, and it was mainly women. So it is just much more common in women. Any other questions in the room? Yep. So the question is Chiari malformation and SCAD. I am unaware of any.
So I have not, so what I'd probably do is I'd look on PubMed, but not that come to mind, and we haven't looked at it. It's not, when we go through the data, because we have abstractors, but we ourselves often look at the granular data. We haven't seen that be a trend. When we start noticing trends, we start marking it down. But now that you ask about it, I'll keep my eyes open.
There are a couple of, for the last question I'm going to answer, there's several questions from online that are saying, what are the SCAD-specific medications? Do I need to be on anything for life? Why do some people say beta blockers for life? I would just say stay tuned. As we said, there aren't any medications that are SCAD-specific. Many patients are told to be on aspirin long-term, but there's no data to suggest that that may benefit, and I've backed off on using aspirin a bit, but I think for the first year it's reasonable. I have not told a patient you're going to be on any of SCAD or not, that you're going to be on a medication for life in probably a decade. I say until we have something better or for the foreseeable future. Because I've been in this game for a long time, and I have seen so many changes over even the past 5 years where we were telling somebody to take something and we told them don't, and vice versa. So I think don't let somebody say anything really for life. It really is until we have better answers or something better to offer. Because I think when you hear you're going to be on that for life, even if it's aspirin and you had a stent, you somehow, that sounds so fatalistic. And in, my perspective of doing this for decades is many of the things I told patients to do for life 20 years ago, they are happily not doing anymore, or I told them to, or vice versa. So I think we think about, frame this is we're doing this the best we can with the data available that may evolve and give us a clear picture of what individuals need to do. I will say, I want you to have a normal blood pressure for life. I may change that. I may say, oh yeah, sure, you can become hypertensive when you're 50, but I probably won't. And so as long as, probably won't.
Differences in practice.
No, I don't think I will. And so I may not tell you what drug I'd like you to achieve or lifestyle factor, but I will tell SCAD patients, I want you to be under that 120/80 throughout your lifetime, but not tell you how you're going to reach that, because there may be genetic treatments that evolve that normalize blood pressure at some point. So I think we don't want to limit our thinking by saying you're going to need to do or take something. And I think the other helpful thing as we wrap this evening up is what we're talking about tonight about SCAD is not going to be true in 10 years. There will be so much more that we will have to offer to tell you, and I would just say stay tuned. So thank you very much for being here tonight and for everything you do for us.